welcome everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening to everybody else joining us virtually from around the world. My name is Maimouna Mahmoud. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome you all to this roundtable session titled Modeling for Anticipatory Action, Building Better Humanitarian Response to Conflict and Climate Shocks in Fragile Countries. This roundtable discussion is organized by the Danish Refugee Council and the Mixed Migration Center. Following the launch of the UN Early Warning for All Action Plan in 2022, nearly 37 anticipatory action frameworks have been activated to respond mostly to climatic events like floods, droughts, and disease outbreaks, among other pressing issues, with some evidence suggesting that around 3.6 million people have been reached with that action. Despite this level of commitment and accelerated response, we find that progress on anticipatory action related to conflict and displacement to be lagging. The purpose of this roundtable is to highlight the opportunities and benefits of expanding anticipatory action and leveraging technologies to adequately respond to conflict-induced displacement. You will hear about the opportunities and the current approaches, as well as potential ethical concerns surrounding preventative action and particularly in fragile and conflict-affected societies. Before I can introduce our speakers for this morning, a couple of housekeeping items. For those joining us in person, welcome again. Please hold your comments and your questions until after everybody had spoken. For our guests online, thanks again for being with us. We will have a session dedicated to Q&A. Please feel free, however, to put down your comments and your questions in the chat. We will be monitoring those regularly throughout the session. So I'm delighted to introduce the speakers for this morning's roundtable. We have joining from Djibouti, Dr. Ahmed Amtihoun, who's the Regional Program Manager for Disaster Risk Management at IGAD's Climate Prediction and Application Center. Welcome, Dr. Ahmed. From the region as well, from Mogadishu, we have Mr. Hassan Khader, who is the Director of Disaster Risk Management at the Somalia Disaster Management Agency. Welcome. Cannot see you yet, but welcome. We have in person here in Washington, D.C. Hi, hello. We have in person here in Washington, D.C., Dr. Ayla Bonfilio, who's the Director of Eastern and Southern Africa, Egypt, and Yemen at the Mixed Migration Center, and Mr. Alexander Kiram, who's the Senior Analyst at the Danish Refugee Council and author of the Global Displacement Forecast Report. We also have two discussants with us, Laura Nistiri, who is the Global Displacement Tracking Matrix Coordinator at IOM, and Dr. Tegan Lane, who is the Director for Climate, Environment, and Conflict at the United States Institute of Peace. Welcome to you all. Dr. Ahmed, if we can start with you.
Yes, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm ready, thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon to you. Please, we're excited to hear about you and the work you do at IGAD, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yes, as you rightly introduced, I'm Ahmed Amtihoun, currently managing IGAD program based in Nairobi. The IGAD Climate Prediction Application Center is one of the regional climate centers actually working on climate forecasting. Has a very pertinent to this important round table is actually just to mention the situations that we came out of. The Eastern Africa region, in fact, experienced about 5 consecutive drought season, which is unique actually for the region, affecting millions of people. Immediately afterwards, around end of last year, we have also experienced quite extensive flooding in Somalia, in Kenya, and Ethiopia. I think this is a new normal. This is unprecedented in terms of the longest droughts in decades, then again, extensive flooding in the region. It's estimated that actually these floods around November last year have displaced about 1 million people combined for Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya, and also have some life have been lost. One important thing which I would like to actually mention here is anticipatory actions or the motivation for regional bodies like IGAD on anticipatory actions is it carries a potential to turn around the cyclical and vicious cycle of disasters and humanitarian emergencies. The key actually experiences that we would like to share with this or in this forum is ICPAC produces climate forecast. We do modeling, climate modeling, hydrological modeling, also disaster displacement modeling. The key actually for this is addressing the first pillar of anticipatory action. How are we defining thresholds for floods, for droughts, and provide clear guidance in terms of timing on activation? How are we advising governments, humanitarian organizations, and others to look at the trends and activate at the right time? So that requires actually to have a very specific and targeted early warning systems in place. As IGAD, what we are trying to do is rather than just giving a weather forecast, we are trying to do a hazard forecast. In fact, we also have a vision of advancing towards impact-based forecasts, okay? More specific, actionable, and timely warnings that can really help to activate anticipatory actions. I'm joined by my colleague, Director Kader here from Somalia, and I would like to congratulate actually the team for activating anticipatory action for flood in Somalia, which definitely have saved quite a number of lives, protect livelihoods, and so on. So I think that ICPAC also supported in defining the thresholds for that flood. The dynamics is that some of the hazards are not just national. There is an element of transboundary nature. For example, the flood in Somalia is not just the rain in Somalia. It is the Ethiopian highlands, the rain Ethiopian highlands that contributed to the flood in Somalia. So that also calls for a cross-border, transboundary understanding of risks, especially the hazard, the exposure, and vulnerability issues. I think that's very central in terms of making anticipatory action more effective, but also more targeted. The key lessons, particularly, which I would like to share also with the audience here, as I bring my intervention to a close, is anticipatory action carries actually a greater potential. The first pillar can be addressed by a regional capacity, like the IGAD Climate Center, ICPAC, here in Nairobi. We have defined, in fact, thresholds for Uganda, in the cross-border area in Uganda called Karamoja. We have also defined thresholds on droughts for Kenya and floods in Somalia. We supported. So all those things, the capacity at the pillar level, at the pillar 1 level is there. We just need to harmonize approaches with different actors actually working on anticipatory actions, but also making systems, getting assistance like from machine learning, AI, and others to automate the whole system, which can, process quite huge data over the many years of data at daily, hourly, and weekly, and so on basis. I think that is number one. Number two, there is a need also to start compiling lessons learned around the world, wherever we have activated anticipatory actions, what really worked, what didn't work, and so on. That is again going to be handled actually for Eastern Africa by a regional working group that we are establishing on anticipatory action. The current chair is IGAD, but the chair LFP, World Food Program. So we will be bringing all actors in the region to be able to exchange ideas and refine some of the lessons learned from activating anticipatory actions. So that's the second pillar of anticipatory action, is the action itself. So we will be refining the experiences and lessons around that. The third and most challenging pillar for us as Eastern Africa region is the pre-financing bit. Where is really the finance in terms of acting on, for example, alerts or activations? If we activate, then where is really the resource? Sometimes the good example from Somalia is, I think, worth mentioning. I know Kader is going to come and give us a very detailed account of that. The level we have activated is about $3-4 million US dollars, but the magnitude of the flight far beyond that. So with more resources, I think we can rescue actually more lives, protect more livelihoods, and so on. So I think that is the most important challenge for all of us, how the humanitarian development and also climate finances in general can come in support of anticipatory actions. The pre-financing, if we crack the pre-financing part, we are definitely be making or we are turning pages in terms of, or moving needles in terms of reactive approaches, which is predominantly the case in the region, if not globally, to more proactive approaches, I would say.
Thank you, Ahmed. That's really insightful, and we're happy to see the regional overview of and your experiences. Let's move to Somalia and move to Hassan. Please, can you tell us about the lessons learned? I know Ahmed mentioned the flooding and the early warning system. Please, we're ready for your interventions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Of course, the name is Khadar Mohammed Noor and not Hassan. And of course, yes.
Apologies.
No worries. Of course, may I share few slides? So am I allowed to share?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, it says host disabled participants is sharing. Would you allow me?
We're working on it.
Oh,
1 second.
yeah. Now I'm allowed, I think. Yeah. Can you confirm that you can see?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'll put it in presentation mode. Of course, I'll go through a few slides, then I'm sure that I'll go with the time, the 7 minutes, of course. The outline I'll skip, and of course, the introduction is anticipatory action in Somalia are often planned in isolation, and of course, sorry. Yeah, actually these actions are planned in isolation instead of adopting a holistic and integrated approach. Of course, agencies do plan their anticipatory action interventions in isolation currently, but we have tried to coordinate that one, and of course I'll reach where I'll explain how we do it. So responses to several hazards like drought and floods, adopt a reactive programming approach wherein temporary measures are adopted. Of course, anticipatory action measures instituted have little consideration or linkage between plans to action with management to address risks in the long term. Different stakeholders continue to support communities through multiple ad hoc programs with fragmented approaches complicated by short-term funding. The federal government of Somalia, however, do not have a fund set aside for anticipatory action, but largely depends on programs funded through agencies, and it's not usually scaled. Of course, recently we've launched the National Flood Anticipatory Action Framework, which is specific just for flood. And of course, the framework in concise portrays here. This is where this is through the time where preparedness is possible, and of course when the event occurs, before the event occurs, this is the trigger point where we trigger actions, and of course this is propelled or guided by a model, a flood model. And of course, as Dr. Ahmed was alluding to, this flood model has supported by WFB and ICPAC, and of course it has been in-housed in SODMA, Somalia Disaster Management Agency's multi-hazard early warning systems. And of course this has been tested. Therefore, the pilot has been only 5 districts: Bardere, Beledweyne, Bulaburte, Lok, Johar, and Johar. Therefore, these 5 districts are along the rivers. They are riverine. So, which means that we have not been, of course, testing the flash flood, since the flash flood does need a specific, model for itself. So the riverine has been simply easier for us. So we tried, and it was successful actually. Therefore, this is the model, and of course, once we have, of course, I will go back here. So the technical working group includes the ICPAC, and of course the SWALIM, which is FAO, and of course the multi-hazard early warning system, VAM of WFB, and the rest. So, which means that this is an inclusive process, and of course the model has been developed for it. Therefore, so far, where we are now, Anticipatory Action Initiative was formally launched in 2023. Sorry, this is the typo, 2023. Then focusing on enhancing the resilience of individual household, and a model to trigger riverine flood was piloted for 5 locations. So the gap here is no single agents or uncoordinated program can effectively address diverse needs in areas affected by repeated floods, conflict, and other natural disasters like drought. Of course, by sustaining the current status quo, Somalia will face the mounting repercussions of shocks and bear the opportunity cost of missing out on a holistic chance for a shared vision to build resilience future for the Somali communities. Therefore, way forward, the federal government is stepping up to meet the existing coordinating gaps by establishing a national dialogue platform for anticipatory action. And of course, it faces phase 1 portrays a lot of actions, and of course the stakeholders who are phase 2 and phase 3. So this is the process where we will go through once we need to of course establish a coordinated and effective coordinated system or mechanism for anticipatory action. Of course, what we have thought is that an anticipatory action cannot be like any other project or any other humanitarian project, but it has to be coordinated under the government, and of course the government is the entity that's currently coordinating. So the platform, of course, in advance, the developmental solutions promote support and coordination, and of course the anticipatory action would be accelerated, so the interventions are we would talk to each other, and of course will not duplicate. So support developing anticipatory action models for multi-hazards like flood and drought and tropical cyclone, and also epidemic is where we're heading to actually, since now we are having only one model for riverine flood. So coordination, so we coordinate action investments and so on. So which means that, of course, this is the last slide I would take you. So the key strategic area is, number one is strategic area is financing and aligning of funds, and then two, harmonization and coordination of anticipatory action initiatives and projects. Then three is production of knowledge, information sharing, and monitoring progress. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Khader. That's really interesting to see the national dialogue platform, and I'm sure there will be some questions on that. I think next is Dr. Alia Bonfilio, who will be discussing micro level data and how that informs predictive modeling.
Thanks very much, Maimouna. I hope everyone online can see the screen. So I think just to highlight that we're in a way today working backwards. So we've started off seeing how early warning systems at the regional and the national level can work. And now we're going to delve a little bit into what goes into the modeling side, bringing in data, and then, of course, with my colleague Alex, anticipatory action. So in order to build the right model, we have to think, what underpins the assumptions that we make and the variables that we use. And I think this is where micro-level data plays a key role. So it's not that AI and big data is going to replace the need for what's often referred to as old data, but it's really understanding how these two pieces can work together. Okay, so very quickly, just make sure I keep to time. The data that I'll present now comes from a collaboration that we did with the Regional Data Hub of IOM. We collected just shy of 1,000 surveys in Somalia and in Djibouti. And we did it really at the height of the drought crisis, where we saw 5-6 successive droughts during the rainy, when we were supposed to receive rains in the broader Horn of Africa region. And what I just want to highlight here is that this work takes place on an existing migration corridor. That's the eastern route. So that's movement from east in the Horn of Africa going to the Gulf. And why I highlight that is that really impacts the kind of migration outcomes that we can expect, because the conventional wisdom is that you're either going to see immobility or you're going to see internal displacement linked to climate disasters. But when you exist on a pre-existing migration corridor, you see far more diverse movement patterns, and that has to be taken into account with modeling. And if I can go forward. Yes, here. So the key that I just want to highlight quickly is that 84% of our respondents who said that their movement was linked to the drought crisis also had movement linked to at least one other migration driver. Why is this important? Is because then when we build our models, we have to take into consideration interaction effects. So when we have two key drivers interacting with each other, we see also an intensification of movement dynamics. So then we wanted to spend some time distinguishing these more fundamental drivers that climate often represents from actual triggers of movement. What actually prompts, what's the proximate cause here with respect to movement? And we saw loss of crops, loss of livestock, and food price increases often working together all at the same time. So when those triggers come into play, that's when we see a movement outcome. So on average, respondents experience 2.1 triggers in shaping their movements. What's interesting, and we'll come back to it with food price increase, is that also people from non-agricultural areas, from urban areas, can also be impacted. And we see some differentiation here with the kind of livelihood activities that men versus women are engaged in. And I realize that models don't always disaggregate on these demographic characteristics, but it's key to understand that within these big numbers, we can also break it down demographically to understand the different needs and people on the move. And these triggers will come back in Alexander's modeling. third key message is that it's not just one migration strategy. What we saw is that a single household was exhibiting sometimes 3 different strategies. So we asked people who were engaging in international movement linked to the drought crisis, did anyone else from your household also engage in movement? And we saw that if you look at the blue and the different shades of blue, that some or all of them moved is more than 50%. And then when we broke that down further, we saw the majority had household members who were moving internally, but some also had household members engaging in cross-border movement, longer distance international movement, and importantly, 44% had people who had not engaged in movement. So we can think of this group as that key immobile group. So one household, 3 strategies, and we often don't think about that when we look into policy responses, because these are strategies to spread risk. And then complicating it a little bit further, or nuancing the story further, is that we had one father explain the strategy of his household, and he talked about sending his 2 daughters to Hargeisa, key city in the Somaliland region, to work as maids to help their family with something to eat, because he was a pastoralist. He could not get a different kind of job or engage in a different kind of livelihood activity. And so the alternative was then looking to his children to help the family. And so this involved the mobility of the young girls and their family to engage in domestic work. Then breaking down what we mean when we say immobility. Is it forced? Is it voluntary? We found that actually only 12% of people left behind in areas of origin that were drought affected. They were behind because they didn't want to move. More often than not, it was because they had to care for other household members. There wasn't enough money for everyone to move. They had to keep a check on their family's assets. They were too young. And so what it means is when we see a model that is predicting, several thousands of people moving, we also have to take into account, well, what does that mean for the people who are left behind, and how can we effectively plan for those individuals and households? I believe this is my last point. I mentioned this at the beginning, but 30% of the respondents that moved because they were affected by the drought described coming from an urban or peri-urban location. And this is crucial because we think climate disasters are confined to rural spaces, and they're not, because we know when there are crises in agricultural economies, there are knock-on effects for cities if cities aren't directly impacted themselves. And so people get priced out of their locations of origin. So cities aren't just recipients of those who are displaced, but they experience displacement in themselves. And local authorities are often left out as key migration stakeholders when we really have to engage them. That's it. Thanks very much. And I put it over to Alexander. For some reason, I will pull it up.
No, thank you very much. So I'm Alexander Kjørm. I work as a senior analyst and global advisor in the Danish Refugee Council. And I'll build a little bit upon what the 3 other speakers have talked about so far. But basically, we have sort of worked on trying to expand the space of anticipatory action into conflict-induced displacement as well. And I'm almost there. So, and so I'll show a little bit on how we've been doing that and some of the plans going forward. So basically, as we've just heard earlier today, of course, anticipatory action is sort of greatly increasing when it comes to addressing climate hazards. And of course, what is underpinning this is that we have these credible climate forecast models, as Dr. Ackman also explained, and then we've also, identified what are the relevant thresholds for when to trigger the action for anticipatory action. And of course, there's been all sorts of studies on the benefits of doing anticipatory action. One of them has, for example, shown that you get a 3-to-1 return on investment in terms of the benefits for beneficiaries. So I think there is sort of a clear impetus in the humanitarian sector to really expand this approach for more sort of timely and dignified humanitarian response. but we haven't seen really this sort of type of work when it comes to the impacts of conflicts. And really, which at least one of the missing links, one of the reasons, is that we really haven't had any sort of credible conflict impact forecast models that sort of course needs to be part of the puzzle in terms of doing ancestral action. So that's sort of the gap we've been trying to address. So since 2017, we've been working on developing models using AI and machine learning technologies to forecast displacement. So we've been building models both at the national level, predicting displacement 1 to 3 years into the future, as well as the sort of more operational models for ancestral action, looking at the sub-national performance into the future. So these models work essentially by leveraging open source data related to violence, conflict events, kidnappings, food security, market prices, and so on. As we just saw from Isla, I mean, some of these underpinning reasons that lead people to flee in the case of shops. And then we put that into the machine learning model. I'll spare you the details. But what we can see from the results is that we can actually quite accurately predict future displacement, both at the national level, but also at the subnational level. So here, the example is from Burkina Faso, where we get an average error margin down to 14% on the forecast. Yeah. And so with these results, we really see an opportunity for building these sort of ancestral action approaches. So what we can see is that with these displacement forecasting models, we can, if we use them for ancestral action and, for example, set a threshold that, let's say, we act when it predicts 1,200 people will be displaced 3 months from now, we would be acting correctly 70% of the time, which we find to be sort of quite good, but it cannot sort of stand alone. So the way we use these models is to combine it with community level data, also really to make sure that anything we do is really also anchored in the local realities of the communities where we are working. And then finally, we can then combine it with the knowledge from MLC and their data in terms of understanding. So when there are these shocks, how is it that people will actually move and respond? So by combining all these things, we essentially see that we can do ancestral action both in the place of origin, where we can support people, either those that are likely to become displaced, and to provide them with the support that they would need before they become displaced, and essentially prepare them for potential displacement. But of course, also, as we just saw, quite a number of people are going to probably stay behind and maybe be involuntarily immobile. So how can we also support these that may have to stay behind in these high-risk areas? And of course, in addition to this, we can also do ancestral action for people on the move, as well as in the host community. So working with host community, preparing them for an influx of displaced people, and so on. So this is my last slide. I'll be brief. So we're right now testing this out in. We have 2 eco-funded pilots in Burkina Faso and South Sudan, where we have these mechanisms up and running, and we're in the process of starting a joint project with the IOM in Somalia as well on this. In addition to that, we have this displacement forecasting model ready or sort of available and working in Mali and Niger, and currently in the process of expanding that as well to Ethiopia, Myanmar, and DR Congo. So we really hope that we can work collaboratively. I think as Kata also mentioned, I mean, I think this needs to happen in a coordinated and harmonized manner, and with a different group of actors that come together. So we always, of course, we can put these models out openly and look to collaborate with development actors, peace building actors, and other humanitarian actors, of course, to really advance these approaches. So I think I will stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Alexander. If I can just pick on a couple of points that resonate with me, and it's one what Alexander was just mentioning around the importance of coordination and integration across a variety of levels and across sectors. There's indeed a lot of information and a lot of knowledge and data. And in my own research in Somalia, what I see is a lot of this information tends to be siloed, and policymakers, a key group of stakeholders I'm interested in my own research, is really lacking effective access to some of this really vital information. So what does this mean? It means in some ways the importance of investing in mechanisms and processes that allow us to tap into anticipatory models for development, as well as peace building priorities in a number of fragile and conflict affected states, Somalia being a key one that I study. We've also heard briefly from Khadr the importance of supporting governments in their efforts to localize these anticipatory actions. And that's really, it's a huge conversation. It's something that a lot of policymakers in Somalia in particular, but in other fragile states that I also look at, are really interested in. What does localization look like in the context of anticipatory action? The National Action Platform that Khadr mentioned is really interesting. I'm really interested in hearing more about other initiatives in nearby states and other fragile countries, but quite a lot to think about. But the linkage of on this type of information and the importance of thinking about that data and incorporating it in policymaking and national policies is quite interesting. One of that type of information is the IOM DTM, which is the displacement tracking matrix. Can be a significant policy tool, and I've seen that play out in a Somali context. I'd like to turn to Laura, one of our discussants for this morning. Can you tell us a little bit about DTM's approach to modeling displacement and what lessons we can draw out, particularly in the realm of policymaking, but at national and regional and perhaps global levels?
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all the other colleagues. I will build on many of the remarks already made, and thank you for presenting funding in the Eastern. In DID, I'll speak about Somalia, where DTM has already elaborated some projection during the last round. So already in 2021, as mentioned, when the government of Somalia declared the state of emergency, through the DTM, we were able to issue two projections, one more generous, let's say, and one other more conservative, on the impact of the drought-induced displacement. And this, in 2022, in total, 1.2 million new displacement due to drought was registered. And our forecast was not far off. There was a 15% margin of error. So it was quite accurate, although at the national level, to provide an understanding of how this could have impacted. At the same time, as mentioned, drought are not new, fortunately, in Somalia. There was another major drought in 2017, another one in 2011. There were significant lessons learned on the previous events. So what happened? What happened is that, as expected, most of the displacement was urban, so moving to larger cities such as Baidoa or other one, and it was also the complexity of accessing rural areas, and these projections fed were used both by IOM as well by OCHA in filling their response in terms, for instance, of trying to strengthen the response at the rural level or in the secondary city in terms of avoiding this push factor to the main city of Baidoa Banalir. But then in reality, there was partially, again, as already mentioned, there was a delay in funding, therefore in the capacity of financing the actual response, which again tended to be reaction side or reactive rather than proactive. So again, we saw a large push on major urban city. Again, we know that there were already a large population of IDPs in these centers, so already a larger presence of informal site, land and property for housing, land and property issues, as well as then we know also that local integration in Somalia is the most preferred durable solution given the complexity of the coming back. So given already the lesson learned and the challenges, there are also some, and that was already mentioned by Alexander, so what's next, or what's we're trying to do together with this project with DRC, it is to work on district level projection. So that is also very important because in reality, what was realized, it is the relevance of the interplay of the various hazards, so not just climate, but also, of course, the conflict related and the violence, as well as the important then to keep in consideration how this plays at the lower admin level. And as part of this effort of issuing these new projections, also we are trying to have them on a quarterly basis. So taking in consideration the various training and dry seasons, and again, supporting and linking up the operation. And so even working on drafting SOPs, as already was mentioned, that can relate to the various triggers in order to facilitate the coordination and intervention. How they will go, I guess, on the issues and the challenges of coordination at various levels, on the issues of having pre-financing capacity for the, because often analysis is out and data are available. So it's not that we are operating in a vacuum, but then of course how that translates then in the actual response in the field, it's no topic that we're going to.
Thank you, Laura. We'll turn to Dr. Dagan Blaine, who will tell us a little bit about the conceptual linkages between conflict, climate, and displacement. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for the presentations. I've been introduced to some of this work in the past, but it's really great to hear it again, especially in the context of other speakers who laid out some of the work on doing some of the climate predictions, as well as improving an understanding of how people respond to those kinds of impacts and where it takes them in terms of pathways. I was thinking about a couple of different things here and some of the challenges in turning this kind of predictive work into actual anticipatory action. In my past life, before I came to the US Institute of Peace, I also worked on climate predictions and what it meant in the context of international, or in the context of responding to climate impacts in developing countries, more from a development perspective. And I see one of the challenges here that we dealt with at the time, which is there's a lot of work on modeling, and yet the information needs to be useful to people who can actually make decisions about what happens on the ground. And it's a process where, in a sense, two different things are happening at once. One, the progress on the modeling, but two, kind of the feedback from people who actually have a chance to respond about what information they need and what they can actually do something about versus information that they can't actually respond to. And so I really appreciate here the mix of efforts looking at kind of predictions around particular events paired with the information on how people respond to that, because that in theory allows you to design much more thoughtfully anticipatory action. It sounds to me as though one of the challenges still is in thinking about how to build the coordinated set of players on the ground who have the opportunity to respond to this. If you're talking about local action, then there's a certain set of players. If you're talking about people crossing boundaries, there's another set of players. And they're acting at very different levels and to have different kinds of organization and different kinds of networks. And so there's a real challenge, especially when we're talking about climate impacts that drive people away from home and into other areas where that kind of coordinated action and the ability to work on a variety of different geographic levels and with a variety of different choices of approach gets very, very complex. And so for me, it raises a real question about how you build the network to think creatively about anticipatory action, both in addressing the needs of people who are staying where they are and the people who are beginning to be on the move and where they're ending up. That kind of development of those networks is going to be quite complex. However, I also think it's incredibly important to do because those people who have the ability to create anticipatory action probably have an understanding of the kinds of information they need from models and may be in a position to provide really good feedback about what kinds of information would be useful. And I suspect that much of the information you are developing, for example, would be incredibly useful. They might also have feedback on, what kinds of timelines they need information on. What is the best way to communicate information to them that will allow them to make decisions on appropriate timelines and in terms of appropriate actions. That doesn't get at the financing issue, and finance continues to be a massive challenge. But hopefully, with kind of that development of more extended networks around action, it's also an opportunity to think about what that means in terms of finance and to be able to build networks around developing financial opportunities as well. But it's just another layer of challenges. So I think the takeaway for me is there's incredible work here in terms of the modeling and in terms of beginning to set up frameworks for sharing information in time to support anticipatory action. That probably the next frontier is really about how to set up the networks at multiple different levels that really will have to support the action down the line and think about how to connect all these pieces.
It's really interesting. The finance piece keeps coming up again and again, and it is one of the core themes of this Fragility Forum. And I'm wondering, to what extent is it useful to leverage, and how can we actually think about leveraging the power of the private sector in this context? Just an open question to you all before we get to the audience.
One of the questions is very topical to this discussion. Shall I read it out?
Yes, please, go ahead.
So we have Tala Daulat Shahi, who is asking the group, and I think if you represent the donor community in the room, it's, are donors willing to support scaling up anticipatory action and implementing the regulations and the financing necessary? And then from the programming side, is the context of early warning systems for displacement, or in this context of early warning systems for displacement, what is the actual actions, or what are the actions that are being triggered? And so what is the desired outcome for at-risk communities? Is the desired outcome stopping movement? Is it, allowing people to move more safely? Is it caring for those that are left behind and are extremely vulnerable? And I think that's a key, also, in a way, ethical question.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Do you wanna? Who should take a stab at it? Are there any donors in the room? I think there's a question there.
If there were donors, I know that at least one of them, Germany, has dedicated a certain proportion of their humanitarian portfolio to anticipatory action, and it's not. It amounts, I don't know what the percentage is, I think 5%. So it will get, and pardon me if Austerity is here, excuse me. But we've been listening with keen interest, so my guess is yes. And the question is then how? And I had a comment, if I may, but I don't know if this is right.
Yes, please go for it.
I noticed Ayla and Mr. Name.
Alexander.
So interesting. This has been a wonderful panel. My name is Koba Warner. I'm the director of Iowa's Global Data Institute. So it's wonderful to be here. Thank you and congratulations. I'm a colleague of Laura and Risky and Rob. I noticed that, Ayla, you said something that we've seen for years and years in the empirical research on climate change impacts and people moving. And that's essentially people move towards opportunity and away from risk, period. And the households don't differentiate as much as we might on the reason. They're very differentiated in their decision making about who stays and who goes and who does what, because at the end of the day, households want to stabilize consumption, whether literally it's food or their household income so that they can pay for medicine and keep the kid, buy books or whatever. And I noticed that differentiated in your really, and would love to follow up and learn more about your work. We're also being asked to go in that direction with your operations. But I noticed that you differentiated in the drivers, and I wonder whether it would make sense in our work to be clear about drivers of migration and displacement, but shift our approach so that it's operationally relevant. And that has two parts. I wonder if, as a community, we could contribute more so that the objectives for anticipatory action is clear. Because if you're making a decision, we're not making a judgment. We are kind of asking, so what's the information for? What is trying to be optimized? And that means the decision maker probably has some operational realities that they need to optimize. Sorry, I used that word a couple of times. I often feel like in our work, it's not clear to us what donors are trying to do. Is it saving lives? Is it a variety of financial, like how do you make your very precious public resources go farther? And getting clarity about that then suddenly fleshes out a whole bunch of really relevant things for the modeling work. It means timelines. Certain things are cheaper than others on certain timelines, and there are certain constraints. And then anticipatory action and the design of triggers, we can really help take it to this next level, building on the amazing work that you all have. And then when it comes to finance, it's wholly possible for those of you who are donors or working at multilateral development organizations or others to say, okay, this piece completely makes sense for our remit, public finance, for example. This piece makes sense for philanthropy or private sector, or who knows what, risk transfer. And you can layer and put together like a capital stack or a finance stack that can be planned in advance and that then really demonstrates and really moves the needle and saves lives and delivers solutions in an even more effective way. So that was me. There's zero question, I'm so sorry. But I was just very inspired by everything that you all said, and maybe in my obtuse comments, there would be a couple of next steps as a community we might be thinking of. You guys already may be doing that for 5 years, but those are some elements that I haven't yet heard in one together conversation.
Thank you.
There's a couple more.
There's a comment here.
I'll just read these out and then we take a look around the room. So for Alexander, can you share more about the process for gathering and analyzing community level data that supports the open source data you use for the modeling. Then we have a broader question about concrete strategies that can be employed to effectively disseminate existing data and to translate it into evidence-based policy, especially in the context of anticipatory action. And then very quickly, the question before on, well, what are the actions we actually want to see? There's a bit of a conversation developing in the chat where one of our attendees is working on a project on health resilience and ensuring that local health systems are an integral part of these types of early warning systems, because local health facilities and systems or healthcare actors have to be able to quickly adapt.
Alexandra, do you want to take your question first?
Yeah, sure. And I think there was also a question on sort of how can we, what are the actual activities we can do? But so the way we do anti-action or try to do it is actually to build on the approaches that have been done when it comes to climate hazards. So we essentially, when we do this, we go to the local communities and we engage with them. We typically work with disaster risk reduction committees or other types of local committees, and essentially ask them first, what are the indicators that you could see in your communities in terms of potential future conflict and displacement? And are there any existing data that we can potentially use or monitor or set up a mechanism to monitor those indicators so that can feed into our model? The other question we then ask them is, so what is the type of support that you need in advance of conflict and displacement? Of course, both what are the needs that arise because of displacement, but also what are the specific activities you do? Because of course, all these communities, they've been living in these areas of conflict for many years. So they are already doing a lot of things that works for them. So it's not that we need to come in and do a lot of things. We typically just go in and support a lot of the things that these communities are already doing themselves. And then they may need some additional technical support or financial support to do the testing. So that's essential. So we have these, typically in many places where we work, we have these protection monitoring networks that gather data from communities on protection risk that we can see when we analyze the data are quite good indicators of future conflict and subsequently displacement. And then some of the activities we do, for example, in South Sudan, where we're testing it out, we're working with local peace committees to try to see if we can fuse the tensions. But in case we can't really prevent these conflicts from arising, it's around, for example, providing a protection awareness to these communities, making sure that they have access to documentation before they leave, because we can see in many contexts that's a big issue that if you don't have documentation, then you have difficulty accessing services. It's a barrier for returns and so on. So it's really, but again, there's no sort of one, magic bullet. It's not like an activity we do all places. It's very sort of very localized, very sort of context specific in terms of what you can actually do.
There's a question here, and I have a question as well.
Okay, well, it's an actual quick comment on behalf of donors. Me, on behalf of one donor, I speak for all of them. I'm Anelika Andrade. I'm a climate officer in the State Department in the Populations, Refugees, and Migrants Bureau. I think on Coco's line on like what are we trying to do when we give this money? I think we want our dollars to go farther. The farther they go, the better, because it means that we don't have to keep on financing. And I think that the point of trying to see where the private sector and the public sector come in, it's an interesting one. And sometimes from the public sector, we lack the visibility, or we're not able to gauge, okay, what could we leave to private partners to take on? I think we feel an obligation of constantly funding certain tools and activities. And we have put some funding into early warning, perhaps not as much as we could, but I think the challenge we have, and this is a challenge I think a lot of policymakers have, is digesting information and to make it into a decision. And Alexander, an interesting point of your predictions was that, 70% of the time, the prediction is right, which is quite high and it's good. But as a policymaker, it's a big risk as well, because there's still a 30% where you're not going to be right, and you're going to be putting money into something that is not going to happen. So we still have that challenge, and we're very conservative when it comes to decision making, because we're dealing with people and the safety and the livelihoods and the lives of people. So it's managing that risk, and maybe closer conversations. I think you were mentioning it to get more coordination and closer conversations with the researchers, with the modelers, with everyone designing this anticipatory action to better understand what is it that we need and what are the risks? And there's always going to be risks, and there's going to be like nothing's going to be completely perfect, but understanding where there's a margin for maneuver sometimes. So sorry, that was not exactly a question, just more of a comment.
Thank you so much for your comment. A very quick question about the conflict sensitivity dimension. Are anticipatory models and actions inherently in tension with being conflict sensitive? And how do we ensure that these predictive models do not bring about more harm? Is a question that I have for Tegan, but also for Ayla and maybe our colleagues in the Horn of Africa, Qadr and Dr. Ahmed, if you can hear us. How do we ensure that these models are conflict sensitive?
Just a really quick, because I think you'll be answering the majority of it. I think so we complemented this quantitative work also with qualitative work. And when we did, and I think this is really crucial for building a more conflict sensitive approach, because closed caption, survey data doesn't cut it. And we learned that when people were experiencing both drivers related to climate disasters and conflict, it structured their migration in a way where they weren't thinking about moving to the nearest viable location, because that location might be settled by a group that's directly involved in the conflict that one's fleeing from. And so people had to move farther afield to where they had kin located. And so I think when we think about modeling, I mean, it's not a conflict sensitive approach in terms of who to target, but it is in terms of understanding where people are moving and where can we expect movements.
Actually, that ties very nicely into what I was thinking, that I think one of the powerful things about these models is beginning to piece apart some of these drivers and better understand what are some of the drivers of conflict, or where is conflict more likely. But when we start talking about conflict sensitivity, maybe the important part of that is what we do on the ground instead, and how we try to be thoughtful about the risks of conflict in terms of our response to some of these events. Because I found your work here very interesting in terms of better understanding the potential drivers of conflict in various areas. In that sense, it's quite useful in terms of thinking about anticipatory action that can be done in a conflict-sensitive manner. But I'm not actually sure what it means to design conflict-sensitive models beyond using those models to better understand the strength of some of those drivers.
It's interesting. I don't know if our colleagues have anything to add to that.
Of course, hello.
Yes,
I mean, that is right. I really concur with the colleagues. Of course, they have been, we've been testing a model during the October, November, December season. So prior to that, we have started as far as July, August, and September. So we pre-identified actions, and one of those actions included evacuation plans. So those plans should have been conflict sensitive, because the site is planned for evacuation, or the site is planned for those people who would be who would be maybe given cash to evacuate themselves would go, has been planned. But the reality was that there was combination of conflict that was already ongoing along the river, because there was those Al-Shabaab government forces fighting areas along the river, and there were a hill that these people would have been safer and secure. So those maps which have been developed for evacuation purposes have not been conflict sensitive. So people were either way, because they did not have option, they evacuated themselves where even the conflicts were ongoing. of course, along with the other conflict of other forced conflict, there have also been resource on land, issue land, something to do with land and something to do with resource, because there have been few water points, and of course everyone wanted to settle where the closer to water points, and of course those will make things difficult and cause more conflict. So I think our plan is during the planning phase of anticipatory action, we have to plan, and then those plans have to be conflict sensitive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Khadr. And with that, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really interesting discussion. And thanks to the organizers, MMC, the Mixed Migration Center, and the DRC. We are very pleased to have you. I think there will be a note that will be shared to everybody who registered. Presentations and more information and links. So yeah, let's keep this conversation continuing and going. Thank you.